Hello everybody, welcome to Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the fourth album from BT, Emotional Technology. Okay then, let's talk about selling out. It's a process that feels like a bit of a rite of passage that all mildly popular trance artists have to go through by obligation, especially any who started out in the 90s at some point. Admittedly, most of the ones I know of didn't sell out all at the same time, aside from a certain period of time from like 2012 to 2015 or so, which we'll get to in a few videos. And yeah, of course, BT was not immune to the bandwagon of trance artists selling out. Hell, he might have been ahead of the curve in that department a little bit. I would argue actually the point at which BT really sold out wasn't this album, but rather the US version of Movement and Still Life. I still think that album's really solid, has a lot of classic longtime favorite tracks of his, but like I said in that video, you could really tell the record label totally repurposed it into something that would become more marketable to a US audience. And I think it's also worth noting that never at any point did I say that I thought that new direction was something that BT himself fundamentally disagreed with. I get the feeling BET was totally on board for selling out like that. The way he totally looked like a boy band member on the cover, I mean, come on. And in fact, just a year later, he ended up producing for a boy band. He was behind the production on the NSYNC track, Pop. Now, I don't think that track's particularly good, mainly because Justin Timberlake is trying to sell it as so much edgier than it really is. It's not dirty pop. BT does make it more fun with all his stutter edits, but honestly there's not much there I need to listen to more than once. And the reason I bring this up is because his next mainline album here doubled down on all the most commercial qualities of Movement and Still Life US version and tried to cater to the new audience he might have found after producing for NSYNC. Also featuring easily the longest credits list of any of his mainline albums so far, mainly from live band accompaniment, but also recording engineers and technicians and record label people. You get the idea. For a lot of people, Emotional Technology is easily the lowest point of BT's career. It's the album that people point to where they say he completely lost it and never fully recovered. Now, first of all, the whole never recovered thing, I couldn't possibly disagree more with, as you'll see when I talk about his next two albums, but even I can't deny BT sold out pretty hard on this one. And it's probably my least favorite of his albums as well. But I don't think that's directly because he sold out. I think Movement and Still Life US was a much bigger sellout than this was, honestly, and I've always said in the past that just because it's a sellout doesn't mean it's bad. For some people, a more commercial approach can bring some new insight into an artist's sound, and they can use that shift in their favor. I've seen it happen before, and I don't think the more commercial focus of Emotional Technology is its weak point at all. I do think BT had his heart in this one just as much as he does on any other album, and he can do these commercial styles in a way that's fun and enjoyable and uniquely his own. This is my least favorite BT album though, because I feel like it just has his weakest crop of tracks, and it's the one I find the least amount of urge to return to with repeat listens. Really the only thing that this album has going for it above any other BT albums before and afterwards is the stutter edits. This album half feels like a tech demo for that particular effect, and he makes sure to make it as impressive as he can. But the tracks themselves just don't resonate with me on as deep a level as other albums of his can. It's not something I can easily explain. It's not that they're not catchy. I mean, they definitely are sometimes, but I guess it's just mainly because he's got other similar stuff that happens to do it better. In terms of classic BT staples, this album really only has one track with that status, being Somnambulist, Simply Being Loved, and none of the others have really stuck around. Love it or hate it, I can understand either side. It's just a bit of a mixed bag for me and kind of forgettable compared to what he can usually do. So, individual tracks. Now, like Movement and Still Life, I do think the album kind of botches its introduction and takes a while to get going. That's not in reference to the actual intro, The Meeting of 100 Yang, which is basically a clip of Satellite played in reverse and some other reverse and pitch down voice clips from Somnambulist and Dark Heart Dawning. I think it's actually pretty effective as an intro, getting you kind of hyped for what you're about to listen to, especially if you were as into Movement and Still Life as I was. But then we get the real first track, Knowledge of Self, and my enthusiasm dries up significantly. It's another hip-hop, electro-hybrid, or whatever you want to call it, like he tried with Mad Skill's Mike Checka, but more pretentious. I mean, it sounds good, but the rapper Guru thinks he's a lot deeper than he actually is. He talks about being introspective and all that stuff, but he does not really convince me of it. He rhymes poet with know it once, which is pretty corny, and someone as introspective as he claims to be maybe should have thought of something better than that. At one point he also said, I'm father to babies, but he said it in a weird way that sounded like he said, I fondle babies?
I'm fond of the babies.
I couldn't unhear that. Completely ruined the track on most listens of this thing, but even if that was on accident, I still get the feeling he's really only there to sound cool and not to sound smart. He doesn't really sound smart to me, he just says he's smart a lot, and that's just, dude, shut up. Mad Skills was dumb, but it didn't try to be anything it wasn't, just got me into the groove a lot more, and I think that track also sounded better than this, but whatever. Oh, this track does at least sound good. But it's also the only track on here, on the standard edition, with full-on rapping. The next track, Super Fabulous, sounds like it was specifically made to be put in some kind of commercial. The vocals of Scott McCloud going, yeah, come on. They're pretty annoying, and add this kind of trying to be cool plastic sheen over the whole thing. Same with the performance with Rose McGowan, who doesn't really sound like a real person, kinda sounds like auto-generated. Really the only singer I'm able to get into at all is BT himself on the chorus, and even then it's not the best he's ever done. BT has always been at his worst when it felt like he was trying to be cool and hip with the trendy stuff. And while Super Fabulous is really catchy, it stinks of cliches from the time and just doesn't really leave a good taste in my mouth. But as I mentioned before, the first actually good track on this album, we get Somnambulist Simply Being Loved, which primarily exists to show off the full extent of BT's stutter edit techniques. It got a Guinness World Record for most vocal edits in a single track. There's apparently over 6,000 edits to the vocals in this track. And let me tell you, it shows. The amount of crazy editing all over this track is super impressive, and on top of that, it also helps that it's the first track on here that's just a good, enjoyable pop track, completely ignoring the technical aspects of it. Maybe not the most emotionally resonant moment on the album, can feel a tad boy bandish, and it's pretty clearly there just for BT to show off his technical prowess, but is certainly the most fun and easiest track to point to as something that best showcases the strength of this album in particular. Pretty much everything after this will either fall under the umbrella of being some kind of more trance-influenced track with BT's poppier flares being implemented to some extent, or just straight alt-rock in the same way Satellite and Shame are. And there's a surprising amount of the latter. I'll start with the more trance progressive house-ish stuff. And sometimes this stuff is great, other times it's not as much. And none of it is the best trance progressive house stuff BT has in his repertoire. The Force of Gravity almost works well in that vein, but the lead vocals are handed over to JC Chasez from NSYNC. He also did the backing vocals on Somnambulist, by the way, and he's just kind of a mediocre singer. His voice isn't grating, but it's hard for me to get invested in his performance. Much more well-executed examples in this department include Paris, which was co-produced by Jody Wisternoff from Way Out West, and that's a fun guest feature. I mean, it does sound exactly like the kind of thing that would come from a collab between BT and Way Out West, and that's only a good thing. One of the more musically interesting tracks on here. I also think Communicate is a really good one too, and is one of the catchiest tracks on here. It is definitely repetitive, and Jan Johnston also sounds like she was auto-generated by a computer. At least unlike Super Fabulous, she doesn't sound like Siri or something. But the hook on here is one of the best ones on here, I think maybe on par with Simply Being Loved. And the dance grooves are compelling enough that I can forgive it. It's definitely one of my favorites. Karina Ware has a less sterile performance on The Last Moment of Clarity, and is much less repetitive, but the hook's not as good there. Still one of the more fun ones to listen to. I think the best track in this mold, though, is probably The Great Escape. Caroline Lavelle is the female singer on this album that sounds most like a real person by a pretty wide margin, and this track happens to cover itself in lots of orchestral string textures that I enjoy every time. The whole thing has a more personal and intimate feel to it that isn't too overblown like other moments on here can be. It is definitely one of the most emotionally resonant tracks on here. But now we need to talk about the rock stuff here. Now, Satellite is one of my favorite BT tracks overall, so I'm not against the idea of more of that kind of stuff from BT. And actually most of the best stuff from this album also happens to be in this vein. Circles, for instance, sounds pretty similar to Shane, but I think it's even catchier than that track was. And BT can sell it pretty damn well. Our love is cyclical, it moves in circles. Animals and The Only Constant is Change are both trying to be Satellite Part 2. Neither of them are particularly effective as straight follow-ups, but both are enjoyable. Between the two, I prefer Animals. It has the better hook. It's another one that's easy for me to recall the tune to. On The Only Constant Has Changed, BT is totally getting into it with his performance on that one. He's really providing a lot of raw emotion, but the hook isn't even close to as good. I could not hum the tune to this one if I tried. Dark Heart Dawning tries to split the difference and is all the more enjoyable for it. BT giving one of his better performances, and it's pretty catchy too at the same time. But it's neither his best performance or the catchiest on here. It mainly stands out to me because of the backup singers behind him. They feel like they might be giving a bit of a gospel-ish edge to the track. I mean, the whole thing feels like it had more bells and whistles in general. See, I think that's every track on this album. I'm not going into deluxe editions, by the way. There are a couple of exclusive tracks on other versions like Kimosabe, The Revolution, and Love in the Time of Thieves. Tao of the Machine, I think, is the other one with The Roots, which honestly is kind of disappointing for that kind of collab. But yeah, Love in the Time of Thieves is the only one I was particularly feeling. The other two are cool rap tracks, but I'm not huge on them either. They don't really offer much discussion material for me. And in general, I just am not a huge fan of whenever BT involves rapping in his tracks. It's just, it feels like him trend chasing. So now for overall thoughts on this thing. I don't have a ton of bad things to say about Emotional Technology, really. Most of my criticisms come down to he did it better elsewhere. I mean, there's really only 2 tracks on the standard edition I'm not totally feeling, with Knowledge of Self and Super Fabulous, but even those can be good if I'm in the right mood for them. And I'll take them over the worst of Tiesto or Armin van Buuren any day of the week. I think Emotional Technology was an all-around positive addition to BT's catalog, and even for being my lowest ranked album of his, I think there's a ton to enjoy here, and I think it gets way too much of a bad reputation that it doesn't deserve, thanks to its change in direction. But I will still have to admit that none of it really goes the extra mile for me. The only track that I've enjoyed every single time I put on this album was Somnambulist, and even that track isn't in my top 10 favorites from him ever. But there's no track on here that I didn't find anything to enjoy either. Especially once we get past The Force of Gravity, pretty much everything afterwards is solid. I think there's a lot of good stuff here, but I don't think any of it rises to great. Thing is, I think Emotional Technology feels like a slightly misleading title sometimes. I think Technological Emotion would be more accurate, because it's not a primarily electronic album that brings in rock and pop elements occasionally to help give it the human touch. It's more like a primarily rock and pop album that had electronic elements brought in occasionally, and remove some of the humanity of certain areas. Now, I've been told that BT had his laptop stolen at one point during the creation of this album, had to start over from scratch, which led to him not putting as much heart into it as he would have otherwise, but I don't really see that as an excuse, seeing as I doubt it would have been a huge amount different either way. And especially when I'm pretty sure that exact same thing happened again on one of his next 2 albums. I think we already know how I feel on both of those. Yeah, needless to say, I'm conflicted on this. It's hard for me to give it the full thumbs up on it when I know that BT would go on to deliver similar stuff on this vein, but light years better only 2 albums later. But I also don't think it deserves to have as bad a reputation as it does. For all my lack of enthusiasm, I do really like the ideas that went into this album and BT's experimental takes on pop music. I think both the electronic and the rock stuff have no shortage of great moments. It's just the BT album that I always feel the least compelled to come back to. I typically listen to it less for fun or because I'm reaching to listen to any particular track here, and more out of wondering, oh, come on people, how is it that bad? So yeah, I stand by Emotional Technology being a good album, better than most people will give it credit for, but I kind of wish I could go further than that. I get the people who love it, I get the people who hate it. I'm somewhere in between, like a I'm gonna go with a 6.7 out of 10. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.